When we're thinking about the future of education, we need to think outside the brain. In this episode, Louka Parry challenges us to rethink schools as fully human education ecosystems. We'll learn leadership strategies to foster a sense of belonging by getting grounded in purpose, tapping into diverse cultural practices, and cultivating the essential skills students need now and in the future. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. I came across a series that you've posted, and it's The Future of Education from A to Z. And my understanding is that you're making a video about each of those different educational concepts. So I wonder, what are kind of the larger themes and trends that you're seeing emerge about the future of education?
That's such a great question, Cindy. Thanks for your research. I always think, when you think about the way that what's the grammar of schooling? So let's start there. And so you think about A to E, you think about grading, you think about age level classes, you think about curriculum, you think about pedagogy, you think about the pedagogical core, the resources, the environments, the timetable, the structures. And so I guess the provocation for me was, well, that's okay, but that's nested in a particular implicit assumption about how schools should be. And so what might it look like to move from this grammar of schooling towards this kind of language of learning that's nested in a learning ecosystem frame? Because my view is that when we're talking about schooling, education, and learning, we're always conflating them. And for me, they're very separate constructs. Schooling is a social device that was created in a particular period of history necessarily to give everybody a great shot at being employable and also living a good life. Education has far deeper roots. Well, First Nations education, but even my own roots as a half Greek, Greek Welsh hybrid. Like the idea of like an education, the academy. What does it mean to be educated? But learning is a core part of what makes us human. And so, how do we move from this idea of schooling, a structure, a system, and an assumption, towards learning, which is something that actually is within each of us? And so the A to Z that we put together, the kind of this idea of a new alphabet. So rather than when we started with A, of course, and so instead of thinking, oh, I got an A at school, our A in the A to Z learning future alphabet is agency. So
Which is my favorite word.
Oh my God, right? Because again, like if you think about what it means to like live well or learn well, or lead well, for the leaders listening to this conversation, it comes from a highly agentic place. It's I will sit with, and then I will use my capacity to shape, not be shaped. My capacity to act, not be acted upon. And, you can look at all the psychological research on learned helplessness. And I just see it as like, what's the flip of that is learned agency. And it's something that we need to continually cultivate in our lives. So A is for agency, B is for belonging. And again, belonging is the core thing that connects us all. If you don't feel you belong, you can never learn optimally. And so again, how do we cultivate spaces of belonging in increasingly virtual worlds, not just physical worlds? And there's a view, Cindy, as well that I sometimes debate people on. That people say, oh, we don't need schools anymore because we can just do direct to learner. And I often say, oh, well, okay, sure, but I can see your argument, but you need to convince me that the social connection that comes with belonging is not an important piece within a learning experience. And it stumps them, really, because they just can't. It's just, learning is a social act fundamentally. And then we move to C, and C is for creativity. And instead of getting a C grade, like how do we cultivate creativity? You can look back to Sir Ken Robinson's work on this space, especially right now with generative AI, machine learning underpins that. What does it mean to be creative and have create something that wasn't there before? To paraphrase one of my mentors, Larry Rosenstock, like there's something so powerful about the act of creation instead of the act of consumption. And there's a whole piece on technology that we can talk to, especially around the anxious generation and Jonathan Haidt's new book and his work, the Center for Humane Tech. I'm very curious about how do we enable our learners to be creators, not just consumers. There's a huge dynamic there. And then, we can just keep going through the whole alphabet. But, D for us is discernment. It's probably one of the key skills today. How do we ask the right questions? And then E is embodiment. And so that's kind of where we started.
I'm so excited.
Because the embodiment piece is the body-brain contract. It's vagal tone. It's what's your nervous system. What's the collective nervous system? When you're a school principal or an administrator, you're often thinking about young people today say, what's the vibe? You know what I mean? What's the vibe? But really, it's quite measurable. when people feel safe, seen, valued, that's when they do their best work. That's where the best learning takes place. And goodness gracious me, isn't it a wonderful thing to see young people expanding just as the adults around them expand at the same time in a learning space?
There's so much I love about what you said there. I've got to tell a story from my classroom. So I was a grade 5
Okay.
teacher. And I came back in and, the kids were all like flustered and the specialist teacher was like, they'd had a really, a bad class. And we sat down together and I was like, guys, what's up? Like, we never get these kinds of reports from specialists. What's going on here? And one of my kids was like, Miss Cindy, the vibe was just off in here. And I was like, my hippy dippy mindset has permeated this classroom officially. When a fifth grader will say the vibe was just off. But I truly think that embodiment has gotten so little attention in the education space. And we think about thinking as this thing that just happens in our brains. And I think that that's going to be in the next 5 years, the most important concept. Would you agree that that's...
Oh, Cindy, you're talking my language. Look, you're absolutely right. And I think what's interesting is this kind of, you describe yourself as like this hippy dippy mindset of like creating a particular space. What we now know from the emotion sciences and even the affective neurosciences is unless you care about something, you can't learn it. And actually you
Right.
can measure the collective emotional tone of a space. And so, yeah, when the vibe is off, we've all experienced this practically as practitioners, right? It's hard, as we'd say in Australia, hard yakka. It's very hard work. And the point is, it's actually not even beneficial to continue with your pre-planned work at that point in time. You need to, as great educators do, you need to adapt. You need to like effectively improvise on the spot to say, okay, I can feel something is happening here that is impacting the social container in which this learning experience is happening. How do we shift that? And the way to do it is through embodiment practice or contemplative practices, Cindy. This is what I've realized, especially with our work at Karanga, which is a nonprofit that I'm lucky to co-lead as well, which is in the field of social emotional learning. It's okay. How do we tap into our kind of emotional system or the social connectedness? Something is off here. And let's do that before we try to just continue with the cognitive grappling, which is the core thing we should continue to do. So absolutely, let's just take a belly breath, everybody. Oh, let's trace on our finger. If you're a primary teacher, let's trace on our fingers, 5 by 5. Goodness gracious. It's as if we forgot about the body because we thought it all happens in the brain. And thankfully, we've got some great thinkers like Andrew Huberman that are talking about the body-brain contract. He's out of Stanford. And this idea is something around the embodiment that I agree with you will be a huge theme into the future.
If you're looking for a really cool read, The Extended Mind by Annie Paul Murphy was one I read recently that really...
Yep, absolutely.
Such a great...
Isn't it good?
The power of gesture, the power of thinking together in teams, thinking visibly. I just think, especially like you were saying in the AI future, there is going to be such a power that comes with being connected to our bodies, being able to make our thinking visible with one another and being just kind of present. Let's just write a book together, you and I, called The Education Vibe.
I'm into it. I'm into it, Cindy. I think it'll write itself, frankly. Yeah, and that
Right.
Annie Murphy Paul's work, so good. Embodied cognition, situated cognition, distributed cognition. There's 3 big themes that, like, we have to understand that learning happens outside the brain, beyond the brain. And that's such a great insight. And I have to say, as a former drama teacher, it makes a lot of sense to me as well, right? And I guess it's something like we somehow lose that embodiment as we go through the stages of schooling. And I work primarily with adults, with school leaders and educators now. And so the challenge for me as well is to say, actually, these are still human beings with bodies. We all have the same nervous system. It's actually kind of incredibly irresponsible for us, A, not to know about it, and B, not to be using it in our learning experiences. I'll say one last thing, Cindy, on this, because one of the pieces of work that we've been building is a BQ program. And so this is really interesting insight when you go, okay, IQ, which dominated really most of the 20th century until really 1995 when Daniel Goleman wrote Emotional Intelligence, and then the era of the EQ, Cohen was born for the last 30 years, let's say. And I think what we're realizing now is that it is this piece around embodiment, which is it's not actually psychology, it's psychophysiology, which is bringing the brain and the body together because they operate together as a Venn diagram. And so we're very curious about, BQ as a base plate upon which EQ can function, upon which IQ can function. And that probably being the right kind of taxonomy, because it's also, I think, the way that, well, I mean, it's the way that the brain architecture has been designed and evolved, in terms of that brainstem, reptilian, into the cortex, into the prefrontal. So yeah, I'm totally on the vibe train with you, Cindy. All that to say, let's go for it.
You are really a nerd. I like it. We read the same things, it sounds like.
Big time.
I can't read those things before bed, though, because I get too excited. Like, I have
I
to.
can't.
I'm so glad that you brought up the Karanga Project. And I saw a little bit about that on your website. Might you speak a little bit more to the insights there and the connection between SEL and the future and just the work that you're doing?
Thank you, Cindy. It's such a great community, actually. And I guess when we ask what might be the future of learning that we want, it's all well and good to ask the question, but you have to take a view on it. You have to have some flags in the sand. And one of my flags is absolutely this idea of a fully human future, right? A fully human education experience, environment, ecosystem that's nestled around the uniqueness of every single learner and every single adult that includes as well, because all of us are learners. In the United States, where you are, Cindy, there's this wonderful organization called CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, based out of Chicago. They are a wonderful team and have done wonderful work to build this field of research and learning around the power of SEL. And it is absolutely phenomenal. An SEL program delivered during kindergarten, you can still see the impact of 18 years later. It is one of the
Awesome.
best investments we can make in education systems. Just like high quality early years education, James Heckman, the Nobel laureate, is one of the best investments we can make if we care even just about our finances, let alone about the social fabric of our society. So our work now at Karanga really is to help convene and communicate the power of social emotional learning so that we can center it into the middle of our decision making. Because if the future of learning isn't one that is more human, that cultivates not just the cognitive and academic achievement aspects, which is where I think we have come from in terms of the paradigm of education systems, but also cultivates the social fabric of a human being and of a school, and the emotional competencies that matter. So that's what it means to be fully human in my book. It means that you can grapple cognitively, you have very clear social networks, and you have emotional intelligence and emotional agility, which you deploy all the time to self-regulate in a very complex world, which is throwing a lot of challenges at us consistently, especially now when we think about our young people, we look at the data around the levels of anxiety, the levels of stress around the climate. These skills, I would say self-regulation is probably the most important skill to have, because it means you can bring yourself back to your baseline. You bring your whole brain and body back online so that you act from a place of consciousness and awareness instead of a trigger and a response, which is often, the fight, flight, freeze response. And you flip your lid, as Dan Siegel would say out of Stanford, like, oh, you've lost the prefrontal cortex. There's no executive function anymore. And the vibe of the place is getting pretty hectic. Kids are flying off the walls. Okay, what are we going to do? So yeah, our work is really at that really international level, trying to connect the wonderful change makers leading across different regions of the world in trying to bring social emotional learning, into the center of education.
Another phrase that you use that I had not heard before that I really enjoyed was you said life deep and life wide learning. So might you speak to that concept and what you mean by that?
Well, we've always talked about lifelong learning.
Right.
I think it's pretty obvious that we should learn throughout the course of our lives, even if historically the systems haven't been designed for lifelong learning. They've been designed for front end loading, and then effectively like what's called the efficiency paradigm, which is I finished high school, I did my undergraduate, and I did 2 master's degrees. I'm done. And now I
Right.
just use the efficiency of what I've learned. That doesn't hold true anymore. We now need a learning paradigm, one in which there's a currency to what I learned, even in a macro credential at a university. So that's why lifelong learning, I think, is so important. But what I think we miss, even if it's just lifelong, is, okay, what about the other dimensions, the 3 dimensions, which is, well, actually, where am I getting my learning from? If it's only from the idea of formal courses, i.e. credentials and parchments, we're missing, I would say, even the majority of the learning possibilities. So that's where Wired comes in, and we're seeing this now, that young people, often when they go, some of the things they do outside of schools are the things that are most powerful for them. So
Right.
they're working in a community club, or even in a church, or in a sporting club, or they're doing some kind of informal program. We have a whole suite of them here in Australia. And of course, they get these life skills around things like self-regulation or social skills, and sometimes like
Mm.
challenge and resilience and grit, like Duckworth would say. Like, it's all there. And we just haven't valued it, frankly, in our education system. Because what we do is we've kind of put as the pinnacle academic achievement. And
Right.
I'm of the view that we need to elevate all the other capabilities alongside it. We don't need to diminish the role of academic achievement and cognitive struggle. That's exactly what we want. But it's somehow become the sole focus. And so that's where
Mm.
width comes in. It's like, what are the other things happening in your life, young person? Like, I mean, you ask any young person today, they're probably learning a whole bunch of stuff from TikTok, and they're learning a whole bunch of stuff, which may or may not be accurate, by the way. But, it's so engaging. So there's that. And then, of course, the depth is around intensity, Cindy. And it's why I think the future of schools in particular that are able to craft these is like, how do you create these intensive experiences? Ones that where you drop in, i.e. you go out onto a campus that isn't the normal campus. It's in the bush, as we would say in Australia. Like, it's in a forest, it's
Mm.
outdoors somewhere, it's on the lake. Like, go and spend some time there. There's the idea of depth. And this is like, do less better. What we do is we cram everything into our young people's heads. And it's actually, what's probably more powerful is just to say, hey, we're just trying to give you some capabilities, because we know that learning doesn't finish at age 18. In fact, it's just getting started. So if we can
Yes.
develop enough meta learning and metacognition, if young
And
people know,
curiosity.
oh my goodness, if they know how to learn, how they learn best, and they have a
Yes.
passion for learning, it's kind of job done. They may
Right.
not have all the curriculum knowledge, but they'll
Who
come to
needs
them.
it?
They've got their entire life. Well, that's right, Cindy. That's another big question on the future of work, and AI, and at this moment in time. So that's what I mean by lifelong, life wide, and life deep. It's a more wholesome and holistic understanding that learning doesn't actually care about the arbitrary boundaries that we might put there. Schooling does,
Mm.
because schooling is very clearly, a system. But learning, we should try to honor the learning. And maybe I'll give you one final example, Cindy, about why I believe this to be true. When I was a leader in a community, in a very remote community in Australia, which would probably be called a reservation in the United States, I
Okay.
was working with First Nations there, in a small school of 100 students. And every year, the young men who were boys, some of them would be taken to go through men's business. Now, this is an initiation process that took a number of months and was the most important thing in that young boy's life, and was
Oh.
incredibly, like, everyone revered this process. Now, our schooling system just basically marked them as absent. They weren't doing anything, because there was that incredibly deep, millennia old process of learning, and
Didn't
there's a
fit
rite
into
of
the
passage,
box.
didn't fit in the box. So what we did, and this was beautifully led by some colleagues, and a leader of mine, Christine Bell, is that we mapped what we were able to, because it's secret men's business. We mapped some of the competencies of what they were experiencing onto a piece of curriculum. And then what we had that was then recognized by our Western system. That's what I mean by honoring learning into education,
Yes.
into the schooling system itself. And I'm just like, I almost get goosebumps thinking about it. That's how we make schools relevant, is we find what matters really powerfully today to our young people, and we make sure that it's not just we're pushing it onto them, we're kind of pulling from them into the systems. And this is when we talk about liberatory system design. This is when we inform up and we enable down,
Mm.
instead of I'm going to inform down and
Right.
enablement, between schools. So that's an example I wanted to share, because I think that, for me, as a young teacher, that really had an impact on the way I see education and the role we can play.
This episode of the School Leaders Project is brought to you by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. We started as a passion project and a school that thought that teaching tech should help teachers do what they do best. And we're now loved by more than 2,000 schools all around the world. Let's dive back into the episode. That's a really beautiful example. And in general, I admire so much the work that's done in Australia and Canada to honor Native culture. I feel like we in the States, we've got such a long way to go in that, in recognizing where people come from and how that shapes who they are, what they believe, and what they learn. So what a beautiful example. Apart from experiences like that, would you say things like apprenticeships, genius
Yes,
hours, like are these things that are taking us in the right direction?
absolutely. Maker spaces. Things where it's kind of like the clubs. Like crazily,
Yeah.
Cindy, we call these co-curricular sometimes. It's like sport. It's as if somehow, or extracurricular is some of the language
Yeah.
that you hear. Oh, we got the curriculum, the important stuff, and then there's some extra.
And there's the extra.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's just like, oh, that's interesting language. And as a linguist, I kind of do sit with it. I'm like, oh, that's a curious frame for us to use, as opposed to really say, yeah, this is all important. And then how do we
Right.
try to recognize it better? And so you're absolutely right. Genius hours are just a great starting point. Any of the kind of club pieces, these are the ways to go, I think, so that young people come in, they bring what they know instead of
Hmm.
leaving some of their knowledge at the school gate, which again is just such a loss
Hmm.
for who they are.
Well, and it's a shift away from a deficit model because so often when we're thinking about the more cognitive side of things, the academic side of things, the traditional curricular side of things, it's
Yeah.
easy to slip into, well, this is the expectation and this is how you're really not meeting it. But in something like a genius hour, you get to move out of that deficit mindset and so much more into that celebration of who our unique and individual learners are.
Yes. Beautiful, Cindy. The phrase I love is, rather than always asking, how good are you? What we can ask is, how are you good?
Oh,
It's just such a powerful way to like honor the uniqueness. And so, yes, there are obviously standards that we want to meet, and there's core competencies that are absolutely key. If you don't have reading comprehension today, you are greatly impacted in your capacity to
disadvantaged.
absorb. Exactly. So everyone needs to be able to read well. Everyone needs to be numerate. But these are the floor, not the ceiling, as the saying goes. And so,
Yeah.
this idea of like, how do you really honor the uniqueness? And that's a big challenge to move a big education system that has been about standardization and
Mm.
actually about achievement standards rather than even growth. And one of my professors, John Hattie, that I studied at Melbourne Uni with, his
Oh,
obsession is
just
quite right.
casually. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I know. How lucky am I? Melbourne Uni. Thanks very much.
That's so cool.
But that was the whole piece. The standard matters way less than the amount of growth that's taking place. Otherwise, we are literally
Yes.
capping the growth of our learners. Like, why would we do that? And so it's know thy impact. Don't just do anything.
Mm.
Do the thing that might matter the most to enable learner growth to take place. And the only critique I would ever have about the wonderful work of John is like to make sure that when we think about learner growth, we're expanding it beyond the academic achievement space. But of
Right.
course, that's where most of the evidence lies. Is this has this amount of growth on my pre and post tests, rather than if a mentor stops a young person from dropping out of school, that may
Mm.
not show up on their academic transcript, but we might have changed that young person's life forever. And so that's a really powerful thing that we should always hold on to when we think about evidence-informed practice, is also to make sure there's a human lens and a qualitative one.
Beautiful. Earlier in the show, you mentioned the idea like there are pieces of education that shouldn't change. And to me, that comes back to this idea of like our human capabilities. So I wonder, looking through the lens of AI, what are those human capabilities that you think are everlasting? And what are the ones that might be shifting in the next 10 to 15 years?
Mm, beautiful, Cindy. What I've noticed in doing a lot of work in the AI and education space is that, and I don't know if this is just like a human phenomenon, we become so excited by the tool and so obsessed by it. And we're like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, look at this, look what this thing can do. And a question I often ask myself and now through our work is, just because we can, should we? Can we be a bit more discerning
Mm.
and sometimes even push back against some of the incentives that a lot of these companies have in their models? And I guess social media is probably the key one to look at here. There's a lot of evidence about the impact of that. So when I think about technology, and a hammer is a technology, by the way. Fire is a
Right.
technology. So technology is part of the human experience and journey and the kind of increasing complexity in our world. But we should, I think it's like how to become more fully human enabled by technology. That's always the frame that I use. Rather than, oh, cool, have you seen this tool? My question is, well, what problem does it solve? And even more powerfully, it's like, what possibility does it unlock for us? I'm very optimistic about how we might like properly leverage some of these technologies to augment the role of teachers and diminish workload in administrivia. Oh my gosh, save me, please. That's, even on the learning design side, on the assessment side, we've seen AI tools now that really are almost as good as us at marking. In fact, it's probably better in occasions. And so rather than being a teacher and taking 50 books home, even going into whatever G Suite or onto Total and whatever, and using that, like, again, using the technologies that really can help us to keep at the center the things that make us most human. And to answer your question, for me, they are things like curiosity. They are things like joy. They're things like love. They're things like play. If we do this right, we do end up with a world of artists and scholars, really. And I mean, that sounds a bit kind of utopian, but I really think that's possible. Because perhaps for the first time ever, we now have a way to extend our minds, Cindy, and augment our cognition in such a way where there can be, what we are able to produce is just so much greater. Now, there's questions around quality. There's definitely like a lot of, I would say, anxiety about how we assess learning and how we don't de-skill ourselves as educators or de-skill our young people. But what it does, it kind of brings us back to the key point of learning, which is process. The product, is probably is now in terms of assessment, it's like less important. It's like, what's the process that we go through as we learn? What questions do we ask at the beginning? And I've done some great podcasts on my little podcast, The Learning Future, with people like Dylan William and Tom Vander Ark.
He's great.
And we've all talked about the kind of questions of, like we always talk about, let's create problem solvers. What we need now are problem finders, and how do we help young people really sit with questions? Like start with the real world and then come backwards rather than I'm going to start with my predetermined curriculum, knowledge, some skill, some competency, and then I'll do like an authentic assessment at the end. How do you flip that and start with authenticity and stay there? And then still rigorous, still challenging, still using evidence and being informed by it. But for me, it's like we must have at the center agency, belonging, creativity, discernment, embodiment, just to start us on that alphabet. Because those are the constructs that I think lead us into that space where we can utilize these technologies to make ourselves more human, to thrive, to be more connected instead of more distracted. And some of the other, or maybe just paying attention to the wrong thing, which is, oh my gosh, have you seen the latest? It's like, great. Well, how will it impact the learning experience? Is always the first question to ask, I think, when we're looking at the future.
Beautiful. Yeah, it sparks. I had Dylan on the show, and I feel like he planted this seed that has come up again and again for me. Is what work is worth the cognitive load? And I think that as experts, that question is easy for us to answer. But for students, that's less so. And that's why we see them cheating in the way that they do on AI, because they don't know what work is worth that cognitive load. And I think that's such a gift and an opportunity for us to develop in our teams, for our teams to develop with our students, is that concept of almost like Pareto's principle. Like, what is my 20%? Yes. What is the 80%? Yes. And what's the best tool to offload that?
That's brilliant. I love that. I like Dylan's work. I actually worked with him this week. He zoomed in.
Small world.
This group of high schools here in New South Wales. I really love that. What is worth my cognition? And I think what that picks up is kind of the motivation sciences. And I often think, like, if we're talking about behavior management, we are so far downstream. We need to move way back upstream to motivation architecture and learning design.
And relationships.
The best moments that we have as educators is like when the bell goes. Sadly, we still have bells in schools, but the bell goes. We need to organize people somehow. And the best moment is when no one moves. No one wants to leave the learning experience. They are so dropped into collective flow that, there's this moment, and it's happened to me as an educator. I mean, way less times than I would like to think, but it's like, but when you're there, you're like, oh my gosh, you can feel something drops in, and young people are completely immersed in a learning experience. And for me, that is why purpose is absolutely critical. We have to understand purpose, self-determination theory, right? Like, what's the autonomy?
Yes.
Like, am I choosing this? I'm a young person. Do I know why this is important? And so we have to continue. And I think great educators always do this. They share the narrative up front. This is why this matters. They would never just use an extrinsic, they use an intrinsic motivator, and then they demonstrate that, even if it's just modeling for young students that, develop their intrinsic motivation over time, as we move from extrinsic to intrinsic, rather than saying, well, why do we need to do this again? Because it's on the test. Terrible answer. That's a terrible answer. Right? Why do we do this? Because this is what the curriculum says. Also a terrible answer.
Because that's how you get people who say, I'm working for my paycheck, right? And what a terrible progression from I'm working to score well on the test to I'm working to get paid and check out and have my beer, right? Like,
exactly.
Who are we trying to create? Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, please keep interrupting me. I mean, this is such a wonderful conversation. I mean, the piece for me is like, it's cathedral thinking. It's, you walk past someone who's chiseling a huge stone and you say, what are you doing? And they'll say, well, can't you bloody see? I'm chiseling a stone. And then you walk a little bit further, 10 feet, and someone else is chiseling the same stone. You say, well, what are you doing? And they say, I'm building a cathedral. And that insight, like, this is why when you look at positive organizational scholarship, when you look at the science of meaning or science of purpose, it's so clearly what is the frame for the contribution you're making, and this is, again, we can come back to the educational research if we want and look at collective efficacy. The people that make a difference are the ones that think they can.
Yes.
It's really that simple. And the difference to do what? This is why purpose matters and collective envisioning matters for us as leaders that are running learning organizations. What is our shared destination? Even if we're holding it lightly, because the quickest way to the future is not a straight line, as the saying goes, as a futurist, right? Future's already here. It's not evenly distributed. All the kind of cliches. But this idea of like, why am I getting up every day to do this work? And purpose interventions are sometimes really needed today, because for the hardworking educators, many of whom are exhausted across the world with our teacher shortage, which by the world, I think it's the World Bank, says we need 44 million more teachers by 2030. And we're struggling to find them in a lot of, I mean, the leaders listening would well know this, even in the international IB sectors. So yeah, there's something to be done here about purpose. And I would love, Cindy, to live in a world where, people say, instead of saying, oh, if you can't do, you teach, what you say instead is, I know, don't get me started. What you say is actually, an educator is somebody that creates every other profession by cultivating the curiosity in young people so they can find what's theirs to do in this world, in their community, in the economy. Like that, teaching isn't rocket science. It's far more complicated than that. Exactly. I really think, it's just such a wonderful place to spend one's life and time, is with the dynamism of emergent phenomena like learning, like the development of competencies, like cultures. I mean, what a honor, what a gift, and I certainly feel grateful to call myself an educator.
Well, your passion really shines through, and just in every answer you have, your passion shines through. And I think a lot of this can feel so theoretical, especially when we're out of schools, it can feel so theoretical. So you mentioned like a purpose intervention. You mentioned a few other strategies. If I'm a school leader and I'm feeling really inspired by this, but also a little bit lost because I am driven by test scores and I am driven by the bell, where do I start?
My first answer, again, comes from like a mentor of mine. It's like, find the others. That's always the first answer. Is find the others. Find the others that think like you do, that believe the same way. We cannot, a man is not an island. I don't even know where that saying comes from, Sydney. But, it's like we are part of this intricate fabric, like that we actually all operate on a self-delusion if we start getting down to kind of biological theory or quantum physics even. We're all part of the same fabric of awareness, of life itself. And there's more foreign cells in our body than our own cells, which is science nerd fact.
Wild.
So it's find the others. Who are the other leaders that you would consider your contemporaries, your peers, and craft a support network. Start there. Step 2 would be actually run your own purpose intervention. Why do you do what you do? I think is a really critical way. I often take C-suite leaders and school principals through kind of sometimes hectic experiences, like writing your own eulogy, so for your life. And you're like, you sit down and you write out what you would like someone to say about you at your funeral, which, by the way, more people are scared of public speaking than of death. So as the Seinfeld joke goes, at the funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy, according to that, which is such a great joke from Jerry. But yeah, so it's actually write down your eulogy. If not that, write down your manifesto. If not that, write down the speech you would like someone to give about you when you leave the school that you lead. So these are really powerful ways to tap into, this is your life right now. Live immediately, as the Stoics would say. Don't put things off till tomorrow. So many of us are kind of in grooves, and if we're not careful, those grooves become so deep they become a rut, and we can't see outside of it anymore. So find the social network, find the others, do your own kind of purpose orientation, make sure it's really clear about why you do the work you do. And then I think we start by starting. Start to bring in some of the practices that make sense. Even things like breath work, some of the social emotional learning pieces. Castle has a whole suite of incredible resources about how you build positive cultures. You know what? It's remarkable. If you build a positive school culture, you quite literally extend the lifespan of the human beings that you lead. Isn't that remarkable? Right. Because of the protective factor that positive emotions have. And that social connectedness, quality relationships, as we know from the longest study into human health ever, the Harvard study of adult development, it's the quality of your relationships that determines how long you live and how well you live. And so, yeah, it's not surprising all my kind of non-prepared answers right now, Cindy, are coming from this frame of relationship to other, relationship to self, relationship to purpose. It's when we feel like we are really supported. I guess the last thing I would say is practice self-forgiveness, self-compassion, maybe even self-love. Thank you for what you do, from me, someone that I'm sure you haven't met, because what you do makes a difference every single day, especially when it feels like you've got nothing left in the tank. The education leaders that I work with are just incredible human beings that have chosen to step into a field that often isn't valued at the level it should. Often it's not financially compensated in that same way either. Often you are the target of abuse. Everyone's an expert because everyone's had some education. It is such an incredibly difficult role. And, so thank you for what you do. And that we only get to transform this together. This is the only way it happens. And you know what, Cindy, I often think this comes from another mentor of mine, Tony Mackay. He's just a wonderful man. And he says, you are the people that you've been waiting for. We are the people that we've been waiting for. It's just so true. Again, it brings back to that idea of agency. But I was waiting for someone else to save me. Or I was waiting for someone to ride in on the horse and be like, we've got to handle the car. I'm like, yeah, great. So yeah, that whole piece, I think, on all of that. But the future of learning, it is here. It's always here. There's pockets of it. And I think it's courage for us to kind of keep doing that. If people are listening to this podcast, Cindy, I think they're halfway, because they're already open to the possibilities of building on the wonderful things that schools have at their core, but letting go of some of the, I would say, palliative elements of education systems that aren't in service of human flourishing. And they're certainly not in service of kind of the more life-centric view of design and of our world.
I couldn't think of a better place to pause. I think that the concept of humanity and joy and purpose has just resonated through this. And I think what a lovely time of year for this conversation to come out. End of the school year, you can be a little frazzled and burned out, but I don't know, there's just so much hope in the picture that you paint. And I hope that I hope that the audience enjoys the conversation half as much as I've been giddy over here being part of it.
It's a mutual giddiness, Cindy. Thank you so much. Really.
Thanks, Louka. All right.